So, on the night of September 1st, 1858, New York City basically threw a celebration that bordered on absolute mass hysteria.
Yeah, it was a state of collective euphoric delirium that is honestly really hard to contextualize today.
Right, because if you were standing on Broadway that evening, I mean, the sheer sensory overload would have been completely staggering. We were talking about a 100-gun salute just echoing through the narrow streets.
You would have felt the concussions vibrating right through your chest.
Exactly, and on top of that, every single church bell across the boroughs was ringing simultaneously. It was creating this deafening, chaotic symphony.
And down the avenues, there's this massive torchlight parade of firemen and citizens winding its way towards City Hall.
Yeah, carrying banners and all these illuminated signs. And culminating the entire spectacle was a fireworks display so intensely concentrated that it literally turned the night sky completely white.
Because the entire city, and really by extension the entire nation, was celebrating what they genuinely believed to be a fundamental alteration of reality.
Which it was, right? I mean, for the first time in human history, a message had just crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Not in the wooden hull of a steamship over 10 agonizingly long days, but as an invisible pulse of electricity.
Shooting through a copper wire laid across the dark, freezing seabed, making the journey in a matter of hours instead of weeks.
The psychological impact of that is just enormous. The old world and the new world were suddenly, physically connected. People were literally weeping in the streets.
They really felt like they had just watched the dawn of a completely new era of global consciousness.
But, and this is where our story really begins, behind the fireworks and the parades, there were two incredibly significant problems with this party of the century.
Right, two massive issues.
The first problem was immediate and highly visible. The fireworks display over City Hall was so aggressive that it actually set City Hall on fire.
Yeah, combustible materials from the display lodged directly in the building's wooden dome.
Which is just wild. By the following morning, the cupola of City Hall was fully ablaze.
The citizens were so thrilled by their mastery of science and technology that they quite literally set their own municipal headquarters on fire to celebrate it.
It is the absolute perfect visual metaphor for the era. But that second problem is the real tragedy of the night. Because at the exact moment the crowds are cheering and the sky is lighting up, the transatlantic cable they are celebrating is secretly dying.
It was degrading incredibly rapidly. I mean, 2 miles down at the bottom of the ocean in the crushing blackness, the electrical signals were fading out.
The operators on both sides of the Atlantic are just staring at their instruments, right?
Exactly, watching the messages slow to an absolute agonizing crawl. The current was bleeding out into the seawater.
And within just a few weeks of this massive jubilee, that miraculous wire would go completely, permanently silent.
Which brings us directly to our mission for this deep dive.
Yes, because we have compiled a massive stack of historical accounts, engineering logs, ship manifests, and scientific letters from the 1850s.
To dissect one of the most audacious, frankly insane engineering epics in human history. The laying of the first transatlantic telegraph cable.
So we're looking at this profound study of human psychology and the friction between theoretical physics and brute force engineering.
Because this isn't a story of a clean linear victory. It is a story of how spectacular, humiliating, astronomically expensive failure is often the exact necessary mechanism required to achieve a permanent breakthrough.
Right. And for you listening right now, if you've ever, say, sent a text message to a friend on another continent or joined an international video call.
Or even just loaded a website hosted on European servers.
Exactly. You are currently relying on the direct descendants of a wire that a man named Cyrus Field spent 12 years of his life, an absolute fortune, and his entire public reputation to build.
You are relying on a concept that initially failed so spectacularly it was investigated as a massive financial hoax.
But he was a man who simply refused to accept that the ocean was an unbridgeable void.
But to truly grasp the magnitude of what Field and his engineers attempted, and why a dying cable caused people to weep with joy, we really have to establish the baseline of human communication the day before that cable was turned on.
Right. Let's step back into the reality of the 1850s. By this point, the terrestrial telegraph had already fundamentally conquered land.
You had thousands of miles of wire strung up on wooden poles across Europe and North America.
It had taken continents that used to feel endless and basically shrunk them down to minutes. A merchant in New York could negotiate with a supplier in Chicago almost instantly.
The terrestrial telegraph introduced the concept of real-time communication to the public, but that network had a hard absolute limit.
The shoreline.
Exactly, the shoreline. The ocean remained this unyielding barrier. A message from London to New York took exactly as long as a physical ship took to sail across the Atlantic.
Which, even with the advent of the fastest clipper ships and early steamers, that journey was roughly 10 to 12 days, assuming the weather was actually favorable.
And that 10-day delay is incredibly difficult for us to wrap our heads around today.
Oh, absolutely. We get frustrated if an email takes 10 seconds to load.
Right. But you have to view that 10-day delay not just as a physical distance, but as a temporal wall. Think about the psychological reality of that lag on human connection.
Yeah, if you immigrated to America and left family in Europe, any letter you received was already a ghost of the past.
Exactly. If a parent fell gravely ill, by the time the letter reached you in Boston, they could have recovered or they could have been buried a week ago.
You were never reacting to the present moment of the other hemisphere.
Yeah.
You were permanently stuck reacting to their past.
And when you apply that temporal wall to global economics, it creates an environment of pure, unadulterated gambling.
Whoa, the markets must have been chaos. Imagine being a cotton trader in Liverpool. You are buying and selling based on American market prices that are a week and a half out of date.
A sudden frost in the American South could wipe out a crop, driving prices sky high in New York. But the Liverpool market wouldn't know about it for 10 days.
Fortunes were made and lost entirely on the speed of the wind carrying a specific ship across the ocean.
And in geopolitics, it was even more dangerous. During the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans was famously fought weeks after a peace treaty had already been signed in Europe.
Simply because the news hadn't arrived yet.
Exactly. The ocean was a vast, dangerous gulf of silence.
Which brings us to Cyrus W. Field. He looks at this terrifying 10-day chasm of water and decides he is the man to fix it.
Which is deeply ironic when you examine his credentials.
Because Cyrus Field was not an engineer. He wasn't a physicist. He was a New York paper merchant.
Right. He had made a very comfortable fortune optimizing the logistics of the wholesale paper business, and he actually retired wealthy around the age of 33.
He was a restless, driven man looking for his second act. And a neighbor brought him a much smaller, failing proposal to lay a telegraph wire across the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
To connect Newfoundland to the North American mainland network.
Yeah. And Field looked at the globe, saw Newfoundland jutting out into the Atlantic, and traced his finger all the way across the ocean to Ireland. And he immediately asked,
Why stop at Newfoundland? Why not span the entire ocean?
And in 1856, he formally establishes the Atlantic Telegraph Company. But crucially, Cyrus Field knew absolutely nothing about telegraphy.
He knew nothing about the behavior of electrical currents. He knew nothing about deep-sea maritime engineering.
He was, in the purest sense, a logistical organizer.
This brings us to the fascinating historical archetype of the visionary amateur. We see this repeatedly in major technological leaps.
Yeah, Field's complete ignorance of the physical sciences was paradoxically the exact trait that allowed him to attempt the impossible. I want to focus on that for a second because the hubris is just astounding. Cyrus Field trying to wire the ocean in 1856 is like someone today whose only background is running a successful chain of laundromats, deciding they are going to personally fund and direct a crewed mission to establish a commercial colony on Mars.
That is a very apt comparison.
Why on earth did serious investors and heads of state listen to him? Was he essentially conning people by selling them a dream he had zero technical capacity to fulfill?
It's a vital question. The line between a visionary and a con man is often only drawn in retrospect, based on whether the project succeeds or fails.
Right. History is written by the victors.
Exactly. But Field was absolutely not a con man because a con man knows the product is a fiction. Field believed in this project with an intense, almost religious fervor.
He was a true believer.
He was. And the reason he could believe so fiercely was precisely because he didn't know the math. A trained, prominent physicist of the era simply knew too much to even try.
Right. An expert looks at the Atlantic Ocean and sees a terrifying list of guaranteed measurable failures. They see crushing hydrostatic pressure, unpredictable thermal gradients,
Completely uncharted topography.
and the mathematical certainty of signal degradation over thousands of miles.
Precisely. They see the insurmountable variables. But Field, unburdened by scientific realism, just saw a gap on a map that needed closing.
He was driven by this powerful, naive, tech utopian vision.
He actively preached. that if you laid this cable, if you allowed humanity to communicate instantly across borders, nationalistic misunderstandings would simply vanish.
And global peace would naturally, inevitably follow, which is an incredibly familiar echo.
Yes, it is.
That is the exact same tech utopian rhetoric we've heard pouring out of Silicon Valley for the last 2 decades. Connect the world, break down the barriers, and humanity will achieve harmony.
It is the exact same philosophy, the perennial, deeply human belief that a new communication technology can somehow cure the flaws of human nature.
But while optimism and charismatic vision can raise millions of pounds in investment capital and rally the public, relentless optimism does not bend the laws of physics.
No, it certainly doesn't. Field eventually had to confront the reality of the ocean. He needed a team.
He had the funding, he had the geopolitical mandate, but he desperately needed people who actually understood how an electrical current behaved.
And the brain trust he assembled to conquer the Atlantic was as remarkably mismatched as the project itself.
Let's lay out the sheer, terrifying scale of the engineering they were proposing.
Yeah.
Because they needed to manufacture a single, continuous physical cable, roughly 2,000 miles long.
And they needed to lay it across an ocean floor that was, in places, more than 2 miles deep.
2 miles of water column sitting on top of a wire. Just the material science of that in the 1850s is mind-boggling.
It really is.
Because you can't just drop bare copper wire into the ocean, right? The seawater would instantly short out the electrical current. They needed an insulator that could survive the bottom of the sea.
That is exactly where the project almost died before it began, until a providential botanical discovery was made.
Okay, botanical.
Yes. Natural rubber was the common insulator of the day, but it degrades quickly in cold seawater. The breakthrough was a substance called gutta percha.
I was reading about this in the source materials. Gutta percha is fascinating.
It's a naturally occurring thermoplastic latex sap derived from the Palaquium gutta tree, found primarily in the Malayan archipelago.
And the reason it's so perfect is that at room temperature, it's hard and rigid, almost like a piece of wood.
But if you submerge it in hot water, it becomes incredibly pliable and can be molded.
And most importantly, when it cools down in the freezing temperatures of the deep ocean, it becomes an absolutely impenetrable barrier to water.
And a perfect electrical insulator. Without the gutta percha tree, the transatlantic cable would have been fundamentally impossible.
So tree sap basically saved the internet.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So what was the actual design of this cable?
The cable design they settled on was a core of 7 strands of pure copper wire, twisted together for flexibility.
Okay, so that's the conductive core.
Right. That copper core was then bathed in 3 separate, thick coats of gutta percha.
To insulate it.
Exactly. Then that insulated core was wrapped in tarred hemp to act as a cushion.
And finally, the entire thing was heavily armored, with a spiraling sheath of thick iron wires to protect it from rocks and anchors. It's essentially an armored industrial garden hose, but 2,000 miles long, and the weight of it, we are talking about millions of pounds of iron and copper.
So to physically lay this Leviathan, Field brings on Charles Bright, a very capable, experienced engineer, to handle the mechanics of getting the cable from the ship into the water.
Charles Bright was an excellent choice for the mechanical engineering, but the real friction, the core conflict of this entire saga, emerged in the electrical department.
Yes. Field brings on 2 men to manage the physics of the signal.
First, he secures the involvement of William Thomson, right?
Yes, a brilliant 33-year-old Scottish physicist who is rapidly becoming one of the most respected scientific minds in Europe.
You might know him by the title he was granted much later in life, Lord Kelvin.
As in the absolute 0 Kelvin temperature scale, the man was a legitimate generational genius.
He approached electricity through the lens of rigorous mathematical thermodynamics.
Absolutely. Thomson viewed the cable as a complex mathematical problem involving capacitance and resistance. He provided the rigorous scientific grounding.
But in a decision that would basically haunt the project, Field did not make Thomson the chief electrician.
No, he didn't. That title and the ultimate control over the power systems was given to a man named Wildman Whitehouse.
First of all, Wildman Whitehouse is an objectively incredible name.
It really is.
But second, when you look at his background, what exactly was his training in electrical engineering?
He had 0 formal training in physics or engineering. Wildman Whitehouse was a former medical surgeon.
Wait, really? A surgeon?
Yes. He had abandoned his medical practice because he became obsessed with the new fashionable field of electricity.
I have to stop and unpack the logic of this.
Sorry.
We're talking about dropping a 2,000-mile wire 2 miles deep into a totally unknown environment.
Right.
And the man in charge of making the electricity flow from one continent to another is a retired surgeon.
That is correct.
That is genuinely like putting a moderately successful podiatrist in charge of designing the national electrical grid because he's really enthusiastic about the human nervous system.
It's a shocking decision to modern ears, yes.
How did the scientific community allow such an amateur to take the reins of a project of this magnitude?
You have to understand the context of the 1850s scientific community.
Oh.
Electricity was still deeply mysterious.
There weren't degrees in it yet, right?
Exactly. There were no university degrees in electrical engineering. The field was heavily populated by wealthy gentlemen scientists, eager tinkerers, and medical men who viewed electricity as a vital, almost biological force.
So White House was just a hobbyist who talked a big game.
He was a highly charismatic, incredibly enthusiastic experimenter. He managed to convince Cyrus Field, and likely convinced himself, that his hands-on, practical experiments were vastly superior to the dry, theoretical mathematics of university professors like Thomson.
But the stakes here were astronomical. This wasn't a quirky startup running experiments in a basement. This was heavily financed by the British and American governments.
It was framed as an imperial kinship project.
Yeah, the geopolitical optics were massive. This was loudly celebrated as the ultimate Anglo-American alliance.
The cable was designed to run from Valentia Island on the west coast of Ireland, which was firmly under British rule, all the way across to Trinity Bay in Newfoundland.
Connecting the British Empire directly to the rapidly expanding industrial might of the United States.
It's the pride of Queen Victoria and President James Buchanan on the line.
Which makes relying on an amateur surgeon who thinks electricity is an animal spirit absolutely terrifying.
Truly terrifying.
But the momentum was completely unstoppable. With the paper merchant organizing the logistics, the ex-surgeon hooking up the batteries, and the brilliant physicist William Thomson watching from the sidelines with increasing dread.
The expedition finally took to the sea.
And the Atlantic Ocean's response to these two empires trying to sew it shut was incredibly swift and violently humbling.
We move into the expeditions of 1857 and 1858. This is a period defined by such catastrophic, repeated failure that we can accurately call it their brutal apprenticeship.
Let's talk about the specific mechanics of why this was so difficult, because it really highlights the hubris. You can't just toss the cable over the side of the boat.
No, absolutely not. They had to construct this massive, complex payout machinery on the deck of the ship.
What did that look like?
The payout machine was essentially a series of massive iron-grooved wheels and brake drums. The cable would come up from the hold, wrap around these wheels, and then feed out the back of the ship.
Okay, so a giant winch, basically.
Yeah. Right. But because the ocean is 2 miles deep, there are always miles of extremely heavy iron cable suspended freely in the water column behind the ship, sinking toward the bottom.
Oh, I see. And that suspended cable creates massive dynamic tension.
It wants to pull the rest of the cable right out of the ship.
So the engineers have to constantly apply manual brakes to the payout wheels to maintain just the right amount of friction.
Exactly. If you apply too much brake, the cable snaps from the tension. If you apply too little brake, the cable runs out too fast, you waste miles of expensive wire, and it tangles on the bottom.
And remember, they are trying to maintain this perfect, delicate tension balance on the deck of a wooden sailing ship, pitching wildly in the chaotic swells of the Atlantic Ocean.
It was a nightmare. In 1857, they started from the coast of Ireland paying out the cable. They made it a few hundred miles.
And then?
The ship pitched sharply down into the trough of a massive wave. The stern rose, the tension on the cable spiked exponentially, the man on the brake didn't release it fast enough, and the cable simply snapped.
Plop. Gone. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, years of work, sinking into the abyss in a fraction of a second.
The absolute crushing silence on that ship must have been devastating.
It had to be. But they regrouped, raised more capital, and returned in 1858 with an even more audacious plan to solve the weather problem.
Yes, because no single ship in existence was large enough to carry all 2,000 miles of this incredibly heavy, iron-armored cable. They were forced to employ what became known as the mid-ocean gambit.
The logistics of this gambit are just breathtaking for the 1850s.
They took two of the largest naval vessels in the world, the British steam-powered warship HMS Agamemnon, and the massive American frigate USS Niagara.
They stripped out their cannons and loaded each ship with over 1,000 miles of cable.
The Agamemnon was so overloaded with the sheer dead weight of the iron cable coiled in her hold that she sat dangerously low in the water.
And the plan was for these two heavily burdened ships to sail out and meet precisely in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean.
Finding each other in a featureless ocean using nothing but chronometers, sextants, and the sun.
Which is crazy on its own.
Yeah.
And then they would meet, pull the massive ends of the cable up onto the deck, physically splice the copper cores, melt gutta percha over the joint, reweave the iron armor,
Drop the splice into the ocean, and then immediately steam away in opposite directions. The Agamemnon heading east back to Ireland, the Niagara heading west toward Newfoundland.
Think about the physics of that moment.
Mm-hmm.
You have two massive wooden warships tethered together by a single fragile wire in the middle of the ocean.
And in June of 1858, they attempted this, and they were hit by one of the most violent, unseasonable storms in Atlantic history.
Right. The Agamemnon nearly foundered. The dead weight of the cable in her hold actually shifted, causing the ship to list at terrifying 35-degree angles.
Men were being thrown across the decks, coals were spilling out of the furnaces. It was a scene of absolute terrifying chaos.
But they survived it.
Barely. When the storm finally broke, they attempted the mid-ocean splice. They joined the cables, dropped it in, and started steaming apart. They made it 3 miles.
And the cable snapped.
So they sailed back, met again, spliced it again. They made it 40 miles. The cable snapped in the dead of night.
Just brutal.
They met a third time, spliced it, and made it over 100 miles before it snapped again. Eventually, running out of coal and supplies, they had to abandon the expedition and return to port in absolute disgrace.
This is where I really have to ask. At what point does Cyrus Field's relentless optimism cross the line into dangerous delusion?
It's a fair question.
Because his investors are furious, the press is mocking him, his crew is traumatized, and basically on the verge of mutiny. The ocean is violently, unequivocally telling him that this is impossible. Why didn't he stop?
He didn't stop because of William Thomson.
The physicist.
Yes. While the public and the investors saw only catastrophic financial ruin, Thomson saw data. This is the true value of the brutal apprenticeship.
Oh, I see.
Every time the cable snapped, every time the payout machine locked up, Thomson was observing, calculating, and learning.
They were basically failing forward.
Precisely. They were learning about the sheer strength of iron wire under dynamic marine load. They were analyzing the thermal layers of the ocean.
They were refining the exact braking mechanisms needed on the payout gear.
They were mapping the topography of the telegraph plateau on the ocean floor. To Thomson, the failures weren't an endpoint. They were the necessary curriculum. The ocean was teaching them how to conquer it.
And remarkably, Field manages to convince the board of directors to let him try one last time. In late July of 1858, the Agamemnon and the Niagara sail back out to the middle of the Atlantic.
And the crew is deeply pessimistic. They perform the mid-ocean splice, drop the joint into the water, and start steaming in opposite directions.
And this time, the tension holds.
Day after agonizing day, the cable pays out smoothly. The weather remains mercifully calm.
You can just imagine the psychological state of the engineers, standing by the payout wheels 24 hours a day, constantly watching the tension dials.
Waiting for the sickening crack of the cable snapping, dreading the sudden silence.
But the snap never comes. On August 5th, 1858, the Niagara sails into Trinity Bay, Newfoundland, and the Agamemnon sails into Valentia Harbor, Ireland.
They bring the ends of the cable ashore. The continuous 2,000-mile line is completely intact.
They had achieved the impossible. They had successfully laid a continuous wire across the bottom of the ocean.
Which brings us to the climax of the public's understanding of the story, the 16-hour triumph.
Right. On August 16th, 1858, the line is officially connected to the telegraph networks on both sides, and the first official communications are sent across the deep.
Queen Victoria sends a highly formalized 98-word greeting of peace to U.S. President James Buchanan.
And Buchanan is absolutely ecstatic. In his official reply, he calls this engineering achievement a triumph more glorious, because far more useful to mankind than was ever won by conqueror on the field of battle.
He famously declares, "Europe and America are united by telegraph."
And that declaration is what triggers the massive euphoric celebrations in New York that we described at the beginning of the deep dive. Fireworks, the parades, the burning of City Hall.
The public euphoria was so intense that Tiffany and Company, the luxury jeweler in New York, bought up the leftover lengths of the iron-armored cable from the Niagara.
They cut it into 4-inch segments, mounted them in brass brackets, and sold them as highly prized souvenirs.
It instantly became a cultural and capitalist artifact. People wanted to own a physical piece of the future.
But, as we noted earlier, while the public was cheering and buying souvenirs, a terrifying reality was unfolding in the telegraph stations.
Yes, the public was told that Europe and America were united, but they were not told the details of the transmission.
If we examine the logs of that famous first message from Queen Victoria, that 98-word greeting, we see the fatal flaw. It took roughly 16 hours for those 98 words to crawl across the wire.
Let's really emphasize that. 16 hours for 98 words.
That is a transmission speed of approximately 0.1 words per minute. That is not a functional conversation. That is the world's most agonizingly stressful loading screen.
It really is.
Was this actually a functional communication device at 0.1 words per minute, or was it just a highly expensive proof of concept?
To answer that, we have to deeply explain the physics of what was happening, a phenomenon known as capacitance retardation.
Okay.
This is the core scientific hurdle of submarine telegraphy, and it's what William Thomson understood and what Wildman Whitehouse completely ignored.
Okay, lay out the physics for us. Why does a signal slow down underwater compared to on land?
On land, a telegraph wire is strung up on a pole surrounded by air. When you pulse an electrical current through it, the signal travels at nearly the speed of light.
Right, because air isn't a great conductor.
Exactly, but a submarine cable is entirely different. You have a conductive copper core surrounded by an insulating layer of gutta percha, which is completely surrounded by highly conductive seawater.
Wait, a conductor separated from another conductor by an insulator? That's the exact definition of a Leyden jar, or a capacitor.
Exactly. The entire 2,000-mile cable was acting as an unimaginably massive capacitor.
So it's storing charge instead of just passing it along.
Yes. When the operator pressed the telegraph key to send a sharp dot or dash, the electricity didn't just zip to the other side. A massive portion of that electrical charge was absorbed by the gutta percha insulation itself.
Wow.
The cable had to literally fill up with electricity before the current could push out the other end.
So the sharp, distinct electrical pulses, the staccato dots and dashes, they get smeared out.
Yes, the capacitance smooths out the signal. By the time the pulse reaches the other side of the ocean, it's no longer a sharp spike. It is a long, slow, fading wave.
So if you try to send the next pulse too quickly, the two waves blur together, and the receiving operator just sees a continuous, indecipherable stream of current.
Precisely. To send a readable message, you had to send a pulse and then physically wait for the massive 2,000-mile capacitor to drain completely before sending the next letter.
Thus, 16 hours for 98 words.
Yes.
It's incredibly slow, but I suppose in the context of the 1850s, 16 hours is still exponentially faster than a 10-day ship voyage.
It is, but the engineers weren't satisfied with that. And this leads directly to the war between William Thomson and Wildman Whitehouse.
A war that kills the cable.
The signal was incredibly faint because the core of the cable was manufactured too thin, and the capacitance was smearing everything. Thomson and Whitehouse presented two completely opposing philosophies on how to solve this crisis.
Okay, what was Thomson's approach?
Thomson, deeply understanding the math of capacitance, argued that they needed to treat the signal gently. You cannot push the signal faster. You can only read it better.
So instead of shouting louder, he wants to build a better hearing aid.
That's a great way to put it. And he invents an incredibly elegant device to do this, the mirror galvanometer.
The mirror galvanometer is a stroke of absolute genius.
Thomson took a tiny, remarkably lightweight mirror, the size of a dime, attached tiny magnets to the back of it, and suspended it by a single thread of fine silk inside a coil of copper wire.
And then he shined a bright beam of light onto the mirror, which reflected onto a wide scale across the dark room. I see how this works. Because the mirror is virtually weightless, it has almost no inertia. Even the faintest ghostly whisper of an electrical current coming out of the ocean would magnetize the coil, causing that tiny mirror to twitch.
And that tiny twitch would cause the long beam of light to swing wildly across the scale on the wall.
The beam of light acted as a weightless, infinitely long pointer. The operator in the dark room would watch the light beam dart left for a dot and right for a dash.
Thomson proved that with this delicate instrument, you could read the very leading edge of the smeared electrical wave, allowing you to send messages significantly faster using only the gentle power of a standard battery.
It is brilliant. It's elegant. But Wildman Whitehouse, the surgeon, completely rejects it.
Whitehouse despised Thomson's nuance. He viewed the mirror galvanometer as overly complex, fragile, academic nonsense.
Naturally.
Operating from a brute force, almost vitalist perspective, Whitehouse believed the signal was faint simply because it wasn't being pushed hard enough. His solution was immense, staggering power.
He builds these massive induction coils, right? Just enormous magnetic coils designed to aggressively amplify the voltage.
Yeah.
How much power is he pumping into this fragile wire?
He unhooks Thomson's delicate batteries and connects his induction coils, pumping bursts of up to 2,000 volts directly into the transatlantic cable.
2,000 volts. Into an underwater cable that was designed for tiny, gentle currents.
Yes.
Let's look at the physics of what happens next. Gutta percha is a great insulator, but no insulator is perfect. If you push 2,000 volts into a wire, you trigger what's called dielectric breakdown.
Exactly. The immense voltage actively searches for any microscopic weakness, any tiny air bubble or fissure in the gutta percha.
And the 1858 cable was full of microscopic weaknesses. During manufacturing, the gutta percha hadn't been applied perfectly.
While waiting to be loaded onto the ships, sections of the cable had been left out in the baking sun, causing the gutta percha to soften and the heavy copper core to sag off-center.
Oh no.
And during the violent storms, the mechanical stress had created tiny fractures.
So Whitehouse's 2,000 volts hits these microscopic weak points, and the high voltage literally arcs right through the gutta percha, blowing microscopic holes into the surrounding ocean.
And because seawater is highly conductive, the current just leaps out into the Atlantic. Every time he sends a high-voltage shock, he is actively destroying the insulation.
He is burning the cable alive.
It was the ultimate tragic irony of impatience. The desperate demand for efficiency completely destroyed the conduit of that efficiency.
So how long does it last under that kind of assault?
After about 3 weeks of operation and a total of only around 732 messages sent back and forth, the dielectric breakdown was complete.
The current just vanished into the sea.
In early October 1858, the line went utterly, permanently silent. The ocean had won again.
The public backlash must have been ferocious. I mean, they just threw the party of the century, they bought at Tiffany's souvenirs, and now the miraculous machine is dead. How quickly does the wonder curdle into cynicism?
Almost instantly. The newspapers that had been printing poetry about Cyrus Field suddenly turned on him with vicious, venomous attacks. In the absence of communication, rumors filled the void.
And the rumors are fascinatingly modern. People didn't just think it broke, they thought it was a scam.
They accused Field of engineering a massive, elaborate stock market swindle.
The theory was that the cable never actually worked at all, that Field had faked the messages from Queen Victoria just long enough to artificially pump up the stock price of the Atlantic Telegraph Company,
allowing him and his insiders to sell their shares at a premium before announcing the so-called breakdown.
It is exactly the kind of cynical accusation you see leveled at hyped-up tech startups today when a highly anticipated product fails to deliver.
The British Parliament eventually launched an official board of inquiry. The inquiry took thousands of pages of testimony and ultimately placed the lion's share of the blame squarely on Wildman Whitehouse and his reckless high-voltage induction coils.
So Whitehouse was fired and disgraced. But the vindication didn't save the company. Cyrus Field, who had briefly been the most famous hero in the world, was financially ruined and publicly humiliated.
And just as he is trying to figure out how to salvage his life's work, history steps in with an absolute hard stop.
Right. The American Civil War breaks out.
From 1861 to 1865, the United States is consumed by a catastrophic internal conflict.
Suddenly, neither the U.S. government nor the British investors have the time, the capital, or the political bandwidth to worry about a broken, mocked wire rusting away at the bottom of the ocean.
The project is completely shelved.
It would have been so logically easy to let the story end right there. A magnificent folly, a fool's errand, a testament to Victorian hubris.
But Field simply refused to accept that the silence from the deep was the end of the story.
Which brings us to a period we can view as the wilderness years. Between 1858 and 1865, while the public had written the project off as a joke, the engineers were quietly, meticulously at work.
The failures of 1857 and the agonizing 3-week death of 1858 were paying dividends. They finally understood the science.
Because the parliamentary inquiry and the rigorous analysis of the failed cable generated a massive leap in electrical engineering standards.
Exactly. They developed strict new quality control measures. They realized the copper core needed to be significantly thicker to reduce resistance.
And they formulated a new, highly adhesive mixture called Chatterton's compound, right?
Yes, to bind the layers of much thicker, purer gutta percha to the core, eliminating the air gaps that had caused the dielectric breakdown.
And most importantly, the scientific community definitively agreed that Thomson was right.
Deep-sea telegraphy required incredibly gentle currents and highly sensitive receiving instruments like the mirror galvanometer. No more brute force voltage.
The curriculum of failure was complete. They finally knew exactly how to build and operate a submarine cable. They just needed the capital and the machinery to do it.
And that opportunity finally arrives in 1865 as the Civil War concludes. The comeback expedition is launched.
Armed with a vastly superior but incredibly heavy new cable, they faced the old logistical nightmare. The mid-ocean gambit, splicing 2 wires together between 2 pitching warships in a storm, was simply too dangerous.
They needed a single ship capable of carrying the entire load, and they found the only vessel on Earth capable of the task, the Great Eastern.
I am absolutely obsessed with the Great Eastern. Let's detail this machine because it sounds like something out of a steampunk novel.
It really does.
Yeah.
Designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, this was an iron-sailing steamship that was so far ahead of its time it was almost absurd.
It was a true Leviathan. The Great Eastern was nearly 700 feet long.
It had 6 towering masts for sails, 5 massive smokestacks, 2 immense paddle wheels, and a giant screw propeller.
It was 5 times larger than any other ship afloat at the time. It had been a massive commercial failure as a passenger liner because it was simply too big and too expensive to operate.
But it was the exact perfect vessel for Cyrus Field. Because of its immense displacement, it was the only ship in existence that could hold the entire 2,000-mile, 3-million-pound continuous cable in its own hull.
It didn't need a partner. It could just steam majestically from Ireland to North America, laying out the wire in one long, unbroken sweep.
In July of 1866, the Great Eastern loaded the new cable and steamed out of Ireland. The sheer size of the ship made it incredibly stable in the Atlantic swells.
The payout machinery worked flawlessly. 14 days later, they reached the shores of Newfoundland, brought the end of the cable ashore, and connected it to the battery.
And the line came alive. It was robust, it was permanent, and thanks to Thomson's delicate instruments, it was transmitting messages flawlessly.
They had finally won. But that isn't even the most incredible part of the 1866 expedition. Because what the crew of the Great Eastern does next is one of the most astonishing feats of navigation in maritime history.
The climax of this epic is almost poetic. We have to rewind 1 year to 1865.
Okay, what happened then?
During their first attempt with the Great Eastern, they had made it 2/3 of the way across the Atlantic before the payout gear jammed, the cable snapped, and the end plunged 2 miles down to the bottom of the ocean. They had to abandon it.
Just another massive failure added to the ledger.
But now, in the late summer of 1866, flush with the absolute triumph of finally laying a working cable, the captain of the Great Eastern decides to attempt the impossible.
He orders this gargantuan ship to turn around. They steam back out into the middle of the featureless Atlantic Ocean, attempting to navigate to the exact, precise longitude and latitude where the cable had snapped the previous year.
Let's really break down the mechanics of this because it sounds like magic. How do you grapple for a 2-inch wire sitting on the ocean floor 2 miles beneath you?
It's like dropping a piece of wet spaghetti off the top of a skyscraper in the pitch dark and trying to blindly fish it back up using a paperclip on a string.
That is exactly what it was like. It was an exercise in extreme patience and applied mathematics. They used a massive grapnel hook attached to 2 miles of incredibly strong wire rope.
They lowered it to the seabed and then slowly, agonizingly, drifted the massive ship sideways across the projected path of the lost cable.
They had to account for the drift of the wind, the highly complex, layered ocean currents pushing the grappling line in different directions, and the catenary curve of the rope itself.
You can't see anything. You have to rely entirely on the tension of the grappling rope. They had dynamometers rigged on the deck to measure the strain on the line.
Right. If the tension spiked slightly, the engineers had to calculate, did we hook a rock outcropping? Or did we hook the cable?
They dragged that hook back and forth across the abyss for weeks.
They would hook something, spend hours hauling 2 miles of rope up using steam winches, only to find the rope had broken or the hook was empty.
The psychological endurance required is staggering. But finally, on a calm night in early September, the dynamometer registered a specific yielding tension.
They began to haul. It took hours for the winch to pull the grapnel up from the 2-mile depths.
And as it breaks the surface, draped over the prongs of the hook, is the lost 1865 cable. They pulled it up onto the deck.
The electricians hooked up their galvanometers to the wet wire, terrified that the core was dead.
But it wasn't. The incredibly thick gutta percha had held. The wire was electrically alive.
So they spliced brand new cable onto the resurrected end, and the Great Eastern steamed back to Newfoundland, paying out the rest of the line.
So they didn't just succeed in laying a new, functional cable. They reached deep into the black water, physically grabbed hold of their previous failure, hauled it into the light, and resurrected it.
Creating a double victory. By the end of 1866, there were 2 fully functioning permanent threads humming with information across the Atlantic Ocean.
It remains an astronomical triumph of mathematical navigation, mechanical engineering, and sheer bloody-minded human stubbornness.
After 12 years of this relentless crusade, how does Cyrus Field react to this final undeniable vindication? Does he take a victory lap, or is he just utterly exhausted?
Undoubtedly a profound mixture of both. He was hailed globally as the hero he always believed himself to be. The debts were paid, the fortunes were restored, and the accusations of fraud were buried.
But the psychological toll of 12 years of public mockery, intense financial stress, and repeated devastating failure leaves a permanent mark.
Yet his naive utopian vision held firm. He had forced the world to connect, and the fundamental reality of the world would never, ever be the same.
Which brings us to the echo we live in today. Because what Field, Thompson, and the crew of the Great Eastern achieved in 1866 didn't just solve a logistical shipping problem, it completely irrevocably altered the trajectory of human civilization.
The transatlantic communication lag was permanently reduced from 10 days to mere minutes. The temporal wall between hemispheres was obliterated.
Global markets synchronized. News became truly international. But the core thesis we must take away from this saga is the mechanism of that achievement.
It wasn't a story of a genius having a perfect idea and executing it flawlessly.
Exactly. The failure was not the opposite of the triumph. The failure was the necessary path to the triumph.
Every snapped cable, every burned-out core, every brutal parliamentary inquiry, that was the physical process of generating knowledge.
The first voice across the deep had to stutter, it had to die, and it had to be violently mocked so that the engineers could gather the data required to make it speak permanently.
It is a profound reframing of what it means to fail. And it really makes me think about the physical infrastructure of our modern world.
In what way?
We throw around terms like the cloud. We use Wi-Fi. We talk about satellite data. We have this pervasive cultural assumption that our digital world is ethereal, that we are living in a wireless utopia floating above the earth.
But that assumption is entirely false.
It's completely false. The vast, overwhelming majority of all international data, every financial transaction, every streaming video, every encrypted military communication, the entirety of the internet does not bounce off satellites.
It travels through physical, tangible, armored fiber optic cables lying in the exact same mud, in the exact same freezing trenches of the ocean floor, right where Cyrus Field dropped his first copper wire.
The fiber optic cables of the 21st century use pulses of light instead of electrical currents, and they use polyethylene instead of gutta percha. But the engineering concept, the routing over the telegraph plateau, and the reliance on physical submarine infrastructure is identical.
Those 1866 cables are the direct physical ancestors of our modern reality.
Picture the cables lying on the Atlantic floor right now. They are physically humming with the entire conversation, the entire global economy, and the collective memory of the modern world.
It is genuinely staggering to think about. Cyrus Field was a retired paper merchant who knew absolutely nothing about the sea and nothing about physics.
But he refused to stop pulling a thread for 12 long years. He was ruined financially, he was publicly branded a con artist, and yet the invisible echo he started in that dark water has never once gone quiet.
He forced the future to arrive by refusing to yield to the present.
So, to you listening right now, the next time your voice crosses an ocean on a phone call, or you download a dense file from a server on another continent in a fraction of a second, take a moment to remember the 16 agonizing hours it took for 98 words to crawl across that very first wire.
And remember the sheer audacity of the people who sacrificed their reputations to lay it there.
And as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with a broader question to mull over. Think about the massive, seemingly insurmountable engineering and scientific problems we face today.
Whether we are talking about scaling commercial fusion energy or establishing permanent human habitats in space, or developing viable carbon capture technologies.
In so many of these ambitious fields, our early efforts have failed spectacularly. Massive startups have burned through billions of dollars, highly publicized projects have collapsed, and visions have been written off by the public as expensive hoaxes or arrogant follies.
They are in their own wilderness years.
Precisely. It raises a vital question. Are those modern projects really dead ends? Or are we simply living through our own era's brutal apprenticeship?
Perhaps we are just waiting for our own Great Eastern to arrive. The right tool, built on the hard data of our failures, ready to grapple our past mistakes out of the dark.
And prove that our most public, humiliating missteps were actually just the blueprints for our future.